You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 11th of August, 2025, on Monocle Radio.
European leaders scramble to adjust to whatever US President Donald Trump promises Russia. Is there any carrot or stick which can usefully still be brandished at Benjamin Netanyahu? And
goodbye.
No, the show is not ending, but AOL dial-up is. I'm Andrew Muller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Muller. My guests Nina Dos Santos and Isabel Hilton will discuss the day's big stories, and in the month in which we commemorate the 80th anniversaries of the only two nuclear weapons used in war, we speak to Mark Linus about his new book 6 Minutes to Winter, considering the best ways to avoid it happening again. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Muller, and I am joined today by Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue and a visiting professor at King's College London's Lau Institute, and Nina Dos Santos, international broadcast correspondent and former CNN Europe editor. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Hello.
Nina, first of all, you are back from your holidays. You have been to the Balearic Islands, but I am actually more interested in the fact that you have been to Lyme Regis, an English seaside resort, which I think most people, or at least certainly when I say most people, I mean me, would have associated with, I don't know, people trying to go swimming in top hats with like big waxed handlebar moustaches and using bathing machines.
That and well, you know me too well by now. You know, that's how I like to spend my time, with the fossils as well. You know, calling me a dinosaur. Yes, I was in Lyme Regis yesterday, which is the first time for me, which is ironic because I was born in these fair shores, have lived in these fair shores for many years, and we all know that Lyme Regis is part of the Jurassic Coast, which is where a very famous woman, British, made some big dinosaur discoveries. So it's famous for trilobites, ammonites and all those types of things.
And those are some of the younger residents. Yeah.
Those are some of the younger residents on the south coast. It's true, I was in Devon where it's even older a couple of days before. But climate change means that actually it was warmer in Lyme Regis when I was there than the week I spent before in sunny Mallorca, which was also glorious. Palma is highly recommended to anybody listening to this show. Great culinary scene. And Spain, of course, as we know, is on fire touristically. And I mean that in the best of all worlds. And so both places were very nice. But I've got to say, the sun is shining on Britain this week and it's not looking too bad.
In which period, Isabel, you are going to Scotland where sunshine is very much a relative concept?
True, although there's quite a lot of it. In fact, a little bit more than is strictly necessary in Edinburgh, where I'll be spending a couple of days at the book festival, because Arthur's Seat, that extinct volcano, is actually ablaze. So Edinburgh's on fire too, but not in any particularly good way in the opening of the festival.
Are you doing a turn at the Edinburgh Book Festival?
I'm doing a couple of turns at the Edinburgh Book Festival, yeah.
Would you like to plug them mercilessly?
They're both related to China, you'll be astonished to hear. So I'll be talking to Paul French, and then there's a lineup of distinguished authors talking about geopolitics and Asia next week.
Well, we will start in Europe, presently bracing itself for the consequences of this week's encounter between Russian President Vladimir Putin and US President Donald Trump in Alaska, all concerned doubtless mindful of a previous occasion, specifically Yalta 1945, at which a Russian leader sat down with an elderly, infirm American president, and half of Europe spent the thick end of half a century behind walls and watchtowers. EU foreign policy honcho Kaja Kallas has summoned a virtual meeting of the bloc's foreign ministers with a view to gaming out scenarios. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz will do something similar with fellow heads of government later this week. Nina, first of all, how alarmed does everybody sound?
I think the Europeans sound quite alarmed that they, again, are sort of being shut out of the room, and Donald Trump promises that he'll have this meeting with the Russian president, Vladimir Putin, in a very sort of important location for both of those two sides. Obviously, Alaska, the United States having bought that, but, previously had been Russian territory. And Trump has actually just made some comments about it this afternoon, where he said, more or less, don't worry, the first person I'll speak to after I've spoken to Vladimir Putin will be President Zelensky, out of respect, and thereafter I will speak to the EU leaders. That's got to be quite worrying for the EU, because many of those countries, and particularly you mentioned Kaja Kallas, the former Estonian Prime Minister, when she was Estonian Prime Minister, just the other day more or less said, well, look, if this war is frozen and there's a bad peace deal and essentially the conflict is frozen where the battle lines are now, Vladimir Putin will be on our doorstep in 5 years' time.
That is a common view from the Baltics, which I have heard many times in recent years from current and former Baltic office holders. But Isabel, is it not the case that Putin and Trump could agree to whatever in Alaska? Europe and Ukraine don't have to go along with it, do they?
No, they don't have to go along with it. And Europe is, supporting Ukraine very substantially at this point. However, if Donald Trump, in his shall I say wisdom?
Go on.
Were to say that, and he has been saying things like this afternoon, that he's disappointed in Zelensky ruling out a territorial swap, and saying that, he made this extraordinary remark that Zelensky says he has to have, he would need a change in the constitution. He didn't need a change in the constitution to go to war and kill people. And you think, it's just the extraordinary, the way he talks about Zelensky. So I guess the worry is that they do a deal, and when Zelensky says no thank you, then Trump says, well, that's the end of US support for you. We've already seen him back off the threat of sanctions on Russia. He seems to be swinging back into compliance with anything that Putin wants. And that still matters. If he does, claim that there is a deal, I can guarantee that it won't have anything that it needs to have, like security guarantees for Ukraine, because amongst Putin's demands are that Ukraine give up any sort of NATO membership. So who is to prevent Putin in 3 years' time taking the rest of Ukraine? There is no security guarantee built in as yet, and without that, the deal isn't worth the paper it's not yet written on.
Is it not vastly more likely, Nina, and this is my bet, this is the hostage I am offering up to fortune, that Putin doesn't want a deal anyway, that he's simply not serious? He will turn up, he will pitch something that not even Donald Trump would agree to, and say, well, I tried to be reasonable, on with the war.
Well, I think let's remember that Donald Trump has also sent some rather ill-prepared negotiators in to lay the groundwork here. What has Vladimir Putin done to achieve what appears to be a deal that's already been signalled before these two leaders have sat down? That's the important thing, because Donald Trump has already appeared to signal that he's laying the groundwork for territorial concessions, as you were just saying before. Why would you show your Trump card if you were Trump before you actually sit down with somebody as important as, and as good an international chess player geopolitically as Vladimir Putin? Well, probably because you've had Steve Witkoff talking in very transactional terms with the US president. Steve Witkoff, who of course is a real estate developer and not a geopolitical specialist. And then you've also had other, advisors from Donald Trump's side, like, for instance, people like Kellogg, who've come in with more military proposals, let's say, taken into account some of the more military advice that seems to be a bit more grown up. And they've come to some sort of settlement that Donald Trump appears to have said, OK, right, look, I'm after the Nobel Peace Prize. We've got to get this done in time. We've just managed to negotiate some kind of peace between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I need this done, guys. Let's just settle on these particular conditions. Whether or not Vladimir Putin will actually agree to them, who knows, or continue to sign on the paper and then essentially bombard Ukraine further. That could happen too.
Just finally on this, Isabel, and to bring it back to the Europeans who will be gathering in the next few days, there has been talk at various points of something called a coalition of the willing, this being those European countries which are both willing and able to fight if necessary. Is this the moment for them to step up, sort of to suggest, outside the aegis perhaps of NATO or even the European Union, we, the following relatively serious countries, and they have been suggested as the Scandinavian countries, the United Kingdom, France, Poland, possibly Germany, depending on what sort of mood they're in, we will act as a security guarantor for Ukraine and don't try us?
It would take a little negotiating, Europe, but certainly the mood is in that direction, driven by the Baltics, obviously, but also Poland, and Poland is a big player now in Europe, European defence,
so.
And so I think. What the uncertainty there is, the next round of elections in Europe, we might see far-right parties coming in. A coalition of the willing would have to have a mechanism whereby the EU acted as 26, not 27 because of Hungary, but that's doable. All of this is doable if there is the political wind behind it.
Well, to Gaza now, where the long list of Palestinian journalists killed by Israeli action in nearly 2 years of war has lengthened by another 6. The well-known Al Jazeera correspondent Anas al-Sharif, his colleagues Mohammed Kirike, Ibrahim Zahar, Mohamed Aliwa, Mohammed Nufal and freelance reporter Mohammed al-Khaldi. The 3 more were injured in the same drone strike, which hit a tent being used by media outside Al-Shifa Hospital in Gaza City. Israel has claimed that al-Sharif was associated with Hamas. The Committee to Protect Journalists has observed that credible evidence in support of this accusation has not as yet been forthcoming. Isabel, first of all, the IDF has admitted that this was a targeted strike. They knew what the tent was and had a pretty good idea who was in it. Do we think this was due to sudden concern about his alleged associations?
I think it's sudden concern about the fact that he was reporting effectively and had a huge audience and was one of the few journalists left alive who is still telling you what was going on in Gaza. I give absolutely no weight to the claim that he was running a Hamas terrorist cell, and if he was, arrest him and put him on trial. This is more Netanyahu nonsense, and I am beyond angry with it, frankly.
I mean, have Israeli accusations of this kind, Nina, been rendered fairly meaningless by repetition? Because this is their standard line every time that they kill somebody prominent enough that it attracts an amount of global attention.
Yeah, and scores of very prominent foreign correspondents, some of whom are former colleagues of mine at various networks I work with, have written an open letter many months ago demanding access to Gaza for foreign and independent news outlets, precisely for the reason that Isabel is mentioning here, is because it's purely local Palestinian journalists who are in a position to be able to report on what's going on. And if Israel has, ever since essentially October the 7th and the start of the war in Gaza since then, tried to cast them as being Hamas operatives, it immediately discredits anything that they have to say. It's very convenient. And, we are getting some sense of what's happening in Gaza because obviously there's aerial pictures. There's, a huge death toll. We've got foreign doctors going in and out who are from the UK and other countries, and they're not Hamas affiliated. And what they have to say very much lines up with what people like Anas al-Sharif have been reporting. But for Al Jazeera as well, and for the broader journalistic community, it's devastating, isn't it, when you see a large number of journalists of one particular network continue to be targeted, particularly if they're from a prominent Middle Eastern broadcaster that has been targeted, let's face it, not just in Gaza during this war, but also in the West Bank well before the Gaza war started.
Also suggestions, Isabel, that this is Israel attempting to remove people who are likely to be prominent witnesses to what is apparently due to occur next, which will be another major land operation to take Gaza City. Is it clear at this stage, and we are nearly 2 years into this, what the point of this is? Because this would be a colossal endeavour on Israel's part. It would be extremely expensive. It would involve summoning tens of thousands of reserves, and there is no declared endpoint in sight.
No, and in fact, it's been firmly opposed by the Israeli military, who point out that there is no military point to this, and that the army is exhausted. So, absent any other explanation, we are left with the one that we started with. Netanyahu wants this war to continue in order to stay in power, in order to stay out of jail. And frankly, I think it's beyond time that the world called time on Netanyahu, and in particular the United States called time on Netanyahu. Israel is not beyond pressure. Israel receives substantial US aid, most of it military. Most of the bombs that are dropped on Gaza are paid for by US taxpayers. And I think it's time they said that's enough.
Does it have to be the US, though, Nina? Does anybody else's opinion matter? We have, of course, seen, especially in recent weeks, an acceleration of the ebbing of patience of countries, which are usually Israel's fairly staunch allies. And we have seen that expressed mostly in either actual or plans to recognise the state of Palestine. But Israel has brushed all of that off, or accused the people doing it of rewarding Hamas terrorism, though I think everyone's been pretty clear that the Palestine they are recognising will not be in any sense governed or ruled by Hamas. But for all of that, Israel continues, at least Netanyahu continues. Is it only America who can make a difference here?
Well, it kind of feels like that, doesn't it, really? And that's always been the case. Although I would add that Germany's starting to harden its stance quite recently, just in the last week, on Israel, after having been one of the staunchest allies over the last couple of decades, certainly since the not just the end of the Second World War, but since the reunification of Germany. It's been a very strong ally of Germany, and that is suddenly starting to change because obviously they're responding to internal politics in all of these different countries. Remember, electorates themselves are starting to take to the streets and protest. Even your own country, Australia, over the weekend decided to say that it would recognise a Palestinian state, followed quickly by New Zealand. So there's something like 2/3, if not 3/4 of the members of the United Nations teeing up to talk about this particular subject when the UNGA gets underway in about a month's time. So there is pressure, but the point you're quite rightfully making is that what exactly are they recognising at this point? Because Gaza is geographically separate from the West Bank. It is politically distinct ever since Hamas won those elections in 2006. And so, there will still be big questions about whether or not any talk of continuing to try and recognise a Palestinian state would really put any pressure on Netanyahu at all.
Well, to China now, and the apparent abrupt end of a promising career in the People's Republic's foreign ministry. It has emerged that senior diplomat Lu Jianchao, seen by some rune readers and entrail gazers as a future foreign minister, has been assisting police with inquiries since returning to Beijing from a work trip in July. It is not known entirely what transgression, real or imagined, Lu has perpetrated, but memories are being stirred of the 2023 defenestration of former Foreign Minister Qin Gang, who was accused of fathering a child with a woman not his wife while serving as ambassador to the US, and who is now variously reported to be labouring in penitent obscurity or dead. Lu Jianchao, first of all, Isabel, you've met him.
I have met him, yes. I met him actually many years ago. The only time the BBC ever did a question time from China, it was in Shanghai. And he was on the panel, as was I, along with various other distinguished folk. And then I met him again in London earlier this year when he came with a substantial delegation and was doing his diplomacy. He was educated at Oxford, amongst other places, speaks impeccable English. He's quite witty. He is an extremely good diplomat, and this is a bit of a surprise.
Would you like to speculate wildly as to what has happened here?
Not really. I mean,
Unfortunately, wild speculation is
all we've got.
All we've
yes,
got.
I mean, I can say that he is in the tender care of the Central Commission for Discipline Inspection, which is the party procedure.
That sounds like no fun.
It's no fun at all, because you disappear for anything up to 2-3 years before you emerge the other end for a trial which can last all of 10 minutes. So it's not fun. But he will know those procedures because he was in the Discipline and Inspection Commission himself. And in fact, he led the internationalization of that effort when China was trying to get officials back or people it accused of corruption. And it was called Operation Fox Hunt. And he was running Operation Fox Hunt. It was tricky because, of course, not everybody has extradition treaties with China due to a certain perceived incompatibility between the Chinese legal system and that of Western liberal democracies. So he resorted to a few rather interesting tactics: pressure on families at home, the odd bit of persuasion which was unexplained, a certain amount of charming of other governments to see China's point of view. He was a very effective operator.
It does seem weird, doesn't it, Nina, that China, this enormously powerful and important country in this transparent, interconnected world in which we all live, and when something like this happens, it's like we're all Kremlinologists in the 1970s again, looking at the photos of the May Day parade and trying to figure out who's sitting 2 seats closer to the Secretary-General than this time last year. Well,
it's always a sign of autocracy, isn't it, when people start to disappear and you don't really know why and where they've gone. And let's remember that Xi Jinping has been in power since, 2012? That's quite a long time. He's changed the rules. He could be in power forever. And we have started to see a few of these figures, high-profile figures, particularly, as you said, in the realm of foreign affairs, start to disappear. And it makes you feel a bit uncomfortable, doesn't it? Because the question I suppose I have in my mind is not just why, but also what does it say about China's ultimate foreign policy goals? Is there something that he had done diplomatically? He was recently on delegations, as Isabel was just saying before, to the UK, but also very prominent delegations to the United States. Is there something that he might have, had he been too close to the United States at a time when Donald Trump was trying to play hardball over trade tariffs? Who knows? But I suppose the question I have in my mind is this a change in strategy internally in China in terms of their relationships with other countries around the world? We just wouldn't know because so few journalists, just like as we were saying before, are allowed into these parts of the world to report independently. And so there's an information vacuum.
I should say that it's not just foreign policy, though Qin Gang and Liu Jianchao are, both very prominent figures. But if you look at the higher ranks of the military, it's been pretty, extraordinary. And indeed, the general bureaucracy, hundreds of people have been defenestrated. And just today, there was an announcement that a man who actually ran the Regulatory Commission, a serious financier and banker, has also apparently been helping police with their inquiries. So we're well into the 13th year of Xi Jinping, and normally an anti-corruption drive lasts 2 or 3 years. It shows no sign of slackening pace, and now he's taking down people whom he himself appointed. If you were to do the classic criminology thing of reading Liu Jianchao's career, you would note all the points of correspondence with Xi Jinping and his steady progress under Xi Jinping. It would look like a man who was Xi Jinping's man, and suddenly he's not.
Exactly, that's the question. I think it was 6.2 million people have been netted in these corruption and bribery, initiatives to root out corruption, bribery. Not all of them are high officials. As you were just saying before, Isabel, lots of people have been repatriated from Southeast Asian countries that have been lent on very heavily to try and close down all these boiler room scams and stuff like that. But the problem is, there was even a head of a famous Buddhist temple the other day who was accused of the Shaolin Temple, who was accused of various things. So I suppose the question I have is, is this a fragmentation of the sort of laser-focused strategy of Xi Jinping that we've always known him to be famous for? I don't know.
Just finally on this one, Isabel, because I am curious, does this get at all reported in China as such? Would there be a small paragraph in the official newspapers saying he has embarked on an exciting new career trajectory, rubber stamping rickshaw licenses in Xinjiang?
Well, eventually perhaps, but not for some time, not till the party has decided what the charges are. But what you have at the moment are barely audible whispers all around the Chinese internet. And it is, high season for rumours and conspiracy theories and speculation. I've seen about 5 already today about, various power struggles he was alleged to be on the wrong side of, or, was his son, who is in finance, skimming. Because, the opportunity for corruption in foreign policy is pretty thin compared to doing business at home. But his son was in finance, so all of this is going on. Absolutely no one has any idea.
Well, let's move along, and we will ask you both if you remember this sound. Can anybody name that tune? It was, yes, the strange electronic gargle which used to fanfare early interactions with the internet, which used to have to be conducted down a telephone line. Listeners baffled by this phraseology should ask their parents. It, or at least the AOL version of it, will be silenced forever on September 30th when AOL discontinues its dial-up internet service. What I don't understand, Nina...
You're coming to me with the dinosaur quote, right?
No,
I've become an internet fossil.
Apparently, as of the last US census, 265,000 Americans in 2019 were still using dial-up internet.
God, I didn't know that. That's huge.
I know.
It's the audience of a major television network these days.
Average age 103.
What that sound did to me was bring back all those moments in hotel rooms where you were trying to fit the phone, which was always the wrong shape for the acoustic coupler, into the acoustic coupler in order to dial up the newspaper at home oh, God. Oh, agony.
It was absolutely infuriating. I can recall, because we did want to pivot from this to a bit of early internet nostalgia. What I mostly remember is nearly as often as I heard that sound, almost as often there would be a normal dial tone, which was me calling the helpline of my internet service provider, asking for the 9th time this day, why doesn't this bloody thing ever work?
My mother still does that to me. I'm her operator.
But I was completely astounded to find that this was still in operation.
Me too.
In the United States. I mean, don't tell the Chinese or the Koreans, they'll die laughing.
It's quite exciting. It's like meeting someone who still owns a fax machine.
I'm sure they exist. Can you send one?
In the NHS, I think.
Yeah, I don't know if you still can, but I did want to ask you both, because we are, I think it's fair to say, all able to recall a time before all this nonsense. And do you still recall now, ask you first, Isabel, what your first interaction with the internet was? Do you remember sending or receiving your first email?
Oh, gosh. Just about. I'm not sure that it was an email. I remember being given a Tandy, which perhaps you're too young to know about. It was a very, very early laptop, which could remember about a paragraph of text, and it had a screen built in, which was, it was sort of like that. You could see about half a sentence on it.
I had something similar built by Amstrad, which was an absolute pile of garbage, but it did not have any connectivity as such.
Well, the Tandy at one point was the bee's knees for foreign correspondents and for travelling hacks, because it did allow you to produce electronic copy, albeit rather short, and connect to the and send it electronically using that very strange procedure. I can't remember my first email. I can't remember getting an email address, actually. I think it must have been CompuServe, but that's all lost.
My first email address, Nina, was a Demon Internet email address.
That's quite jazzy.
It's just like pretty exciting.
Did you keep it?
God, no. I think probably the first email I sent was possibly one importuning for work for some editor, from some editor or other. So I assume the first email I received was one saying, no, not for us, but thanks. Do you recall what your first either sending or receiving was?
Oh, God. Look, the time the internet came out, I was still in the French lycée in London, which refused to buy non-French computers.
Amazing.
So we were on French computers sending French God knows what. And I'll be honest, I wouldn't say French computers were better than American computers in those days. No offense to any French listeners. And so by the time I arrived, I went to a very scientific university and studied a very scientific subject and ended up having to plunge straight into 6 months of computer programming to create macro models to handle data. And I was totally technologically out of my depth thanks to those French computers, I can tell you that. So if there's any chance to learn new technology ever since then, I try and get on top of it earlier because I think you can't fight it.
If you go back to that period...
But I do remember the dial-up, though.
If you go back to that period, though, Isabel, did you think this was going to catch on?
I wasn't against it because, you know, as a travelling journalist, as a foreign correspondent, the alternative to that awful sound we've just heard was calling up the copy desk and dictating your copy to some very jaundiced people on the other end who, you know. I was on the whole in favour of technology.
Yeah, I'm not glad that the copy takers lost their job. I'm not the kind of person who rejoices when people lose work, but God, those were some of the most passive-aggressive people you could possibly hope to deal with. You
haven't met my mum.
Was she a copy taker?
She was a former correspondent who used to do very similar things.
Yeah, you would call them with something you were incredibly excited about. They'll just be like, yeah, got it, okay.
Have you finished?
Yeah, is that it? How many E's in that word? Yeah, it was.
Yeah, why can't you use it?
How do you spell God?
Yeah, well, we have been delivered from that. And on that upbeat thought, Isabel Hilton and Nina Dos Santos, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, 80 years ago right now, the world was in the very early stages of attempting to comprehend the idea that a single bomb could destroy an entire city. Within the previous 5 days, Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been levelled by atomic bombs dropped by the US Army Air Forces. Ever since, considerable thought has been expended on how best to avoid a repeat of such action, especially since the bombs built since are of orders of magnitude more powerful and much more numerous. A new book by Mark Linus, 6 Minutes to Winter, Nuclear War and How to Avoid It, sketches the problem and some possible solutions. I spoke to Mark earlier and began by asking why the once familiar chant of "ban the bomb" has faded from the discourse.
Yeah, it's like the ban the bomb movement went away, but the weapons themselves never did. And so I think we've become conditioned since the end of the Cold War, those of us who are old enough to remember what it was like at the height of the Cold War, which I think both of us are. Mm-hmm. You know, we all thought peace had broken out and that it was fairly irrevocable. There was lots of decommissioning of nuclear weapons going on. The Cold War arsenals were dramatically reduced, and there were treaties controlling missile numbers from the superpowers, at least, which seemed to make us all a lot safer. And so I think we really just switched off this as an issue, and we've begun to switch back onto it now, the threat of nuclear Armageddon. And I, in particular, switched onto it like a lot of other people in 2022 with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which really was the closest nuclear brinkmanship that we've probably seen since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And Vladimir Putin was very open and very clear about the role that nuclear weapons would play potentially if NATO responded to Ukraine's need in a way which crossed what, you know, Putin's red lines might be. So, you know, it was a case really of a nuclear armed superpower using the weapons not in anger on the battlefield, but using them as a bargaining tactic and as a bullying tactic to try and invade a neighbor. Of course, the irony there, of course, was that Ukraine used to host nuclear weapons back in the old Soviet days. They then signed the Budapest Memorandum in 1994, where they gave up those nuclear weapons, and they were sent back to Russia in return for a guarantee of security given by Russia and by the US, and I think it was Germany and the UK. But that piece of paper had no legal force, and they were then invaded by the very neighbour who supposedly guaranteed their security when they gave up the weapons. So the lesson there is a really clear one.
Do you have a concern that more countries around the world, other than the declared nuclear states and known nuclear states that there are going to absorb that lesson? Because at many levels, that crisis you mentioned between Russia and Ukraine is a pretty good advertisement for the idea, at least, of the nuclear deterrent.
Of course it is, and so's North Korea, and so's the fate of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, who ended up being, dying in a ditch, being lynched by a mob, partly because he'd given up the nuclear weapons. Therefore, NATO was able to attack the regime with impunity. I mean, it was a good thing that Gaddafi was overthrown, as far as I'm concerned, but the lesson was taken on by Kim Jong-un in North Korea, is similarly been absorbed by the mullahs who run Iran, that having the bomb is the ultimate guarantee of regime survival. And it's not just the bad guys. I think Taiwan would probably like a nuclear weapon, or several, because that would be the best form of protection against the looming invasion from the Communist Party of China. And, similarly for South Korea, similarly potentially for Japan, similarly, I'm now hearing a lot from people in Eastern Europe, from the Scandinavian countries, who no longer feel that they're protected by the US nuclear umbrella. Whether or not, in fact, this came up just this last week, where Macron in France is now offering potentially to host French nuclear weapons on the soil of other countries. So the whole system that we've had during and since the Cold War has really begun to fall apart.
And yet we should make clear your book is very much not arguing in favour of nuclear weapons. It is an argument against them. And you do run through a few plausible scenarios in which they might be deliberately used. You run through quite the long and frankly alarming history of accidents involving nuclear weapons, and these are just the ones we know about, a few of which went very close to having catastrophic consequences. But I'm interested in, I guess, what you get into in the later chapters of the book, where you talk about what we might actually do about this. And you isolate the idea of the centenary of the Trinity test, which will be July 16th, 2045, on a day on which we could all agree to set these things aside. Now, it is obviously easier said than done, but do you genuinely think it's actually plausible? Because the obvious argument against such a scenario is that everybody is going to have to agree to do it.
I don't know whether it's plausible. All I know, and I use the analogy in the book, is that solving climate change seemed similarly implausible when I started out on that as an issue back in, a quarter of a century ago. I started my first work on doing a book on climate back in 2000. And at that point, trying to get attention to the issue was really, really difficult. Nobody cared. Nobody knew about it. It seemed to be impossible. The solar panels barely existed, or were, eye-wateringly expensive. Wind was ridiculous. There were no electric vehicles. There were just milk floats. That's a very long time ago now. We're now like a long way into the clean energy transition in all of the sectors and all of the different technologies. So it can happen. And that change came about not just by accident, but because there was this enormous political effort, including world leaders, Greta Thunberg, all the political movements from the grassroots, millions of people protesting, marching, just making their voices heard, that the future of humankind was in peril as a result of rapid greenhouse warming. And I think we've just neglected this issue. And of course, and I had an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal making this point just last week, that actually the threat from climate change is much less imminent than the threat from nuclear war. I mean, nuclear war can destroy the biosphere in a matter of hours and days. Climate's going to take decades or even centuries if you're talking the loss of the big ice sheets. And so why is it that we give so little attention to the issue? And so if there was a huge political movement really focused on nuclear weapons abolition, then we'd be in a different place and it might seem more plausible. I agree, at the moment it seems like a very long shot.
That was Mark Linus. His new book, 6 Minutes to Winter, Nuclear War and How to Avoid It, is available now. And that's all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Nina Dos Santos and Isabel Hilton. Today's show was produced by Laura Kramer and researched by Henry King. Our sound engineer was Elliot Greenfield. I'm Andrew Muller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.